Well, thank you, Anna, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be able to address you today. This has been a really fascinating seminar, and I've learned a lot about your side, the insurance side, and what the ship owners were facing in dealing with the initiative. Is my presentation going to go up on the screen? There it is. Okay, great. So what I want to talk to you this afternoon about is what happened and how we got to where we got with the Black Sea Grain Initiative and where it appears to be headed. So this is a quick outline of my presentation. So let's talk about how things started. Of course, the war broke out on the 24th of February. Ukraine immediately closed all their ports. There, as has been mentioned a number of times, there were more than 100 foreign flag vessels with more than 450 crew trapped. Some were able to get out early. Some tried to run. Of course, we had cases where ships that were trying to get out before any controls were in place hit mines. As a result of that, the Ukrainians closed all of the ports for which they still had control. They also set MARSEC level 3, which was important because because any ship that was going to ultimately be able to get out was going to have to comply with the MARSEC level 3 controls. Also importantly, at the outbreak of the war, the Russian Federation declared the Northwest Black Sea as a war zone, and that any ship in that zone would be considered a terrorist threat, thus would be subject to attack. Now, with all these actions occurring and the closure of the Ukrainian ports, the UN very quickly recognized the threat to global food security, and almost immediately global food prices spiked. It was the highest jump ever since the the World Food Program had started keeping statistics, jumped almost 60%. And you'll see the quotes from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and World Food Program head David Beasley. I think his quote was particularly apt. The world is on fire. We have solutions. We need to act, and we need to act now. So the UN was ready to get into action, to take action to resolve the potential food crisis. The IMO was also involved. Actually, the IMO was the first organization in the UN to call for the establishment of what was known as the Blue Safe Maritime Corridor. The IMO Council, as you can see, met on the 10th of March, less than about 2 weeks after the war broke out. It was actually the fastest a meeting had ever been convened in the history of the organization. So the IMO recognized the seriousness of the problem. Now, the IMO called for the establishment of the corridor. I can say that knowing what I know now compared to what I know then, I don't think the IMO would have been able to do it on its own, because it was a level of negotiation and a level of diplomacy that doesn't really occur at the IMO, which is largely a technical body. Now, also interestingly, very shortly after the IMO Council called for the establishment of the Blue Safe Maritime Corridor, the Russian Federation unilaterally established a corridor to allow ships to leave the Odessa area ports and potentially Mykolaiv and Kherson. That corridor was much further east than the eventual maritime humanitarian corridor in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and no one ever used it. Part of the reason was they couldn't leave the Ukrainian ports, but I think the unilateral nature of the corridor prevented it from being used. I think what the industry was looking for was a solution that was guaranteed to be safe. So with those developments, the UN began a series of shuttle diplomacy efforts, meeting with Turkey, meeting with Ukraine and meeting with the Russian Federation bilaterally to see if we could get the parties together to establish a method to get the grain out of Ukraine. This was critical at this time because the harvest from 2021 was still being processed through particularly the Odessa area ports. Ukraine provides about 20% of the world's wheat. It provides an even bigger percentage to developing countries and countries where the threat of famine exists, particularly in Africa. So it was really critical, A, to clear out what was in the silos already in Ukraine and get those silos up and running or empty so that the harvest that was going to be coming in the summer of 2022 could also be shipped out. So the UN formed a team from the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which had the lead, the World Food Program, and the IMO. We brought in the maritime technical expertise as to how these operations might work. And through that, the general principles of the Black Sea Grain Initiative started to take shape during the spring, including the establishment of a joint coordination center, safe routing, protections, monitoring, inspections, and demining. Now, one of the difficulties we had, apart from coming up with a concept of operations for the initiative, was determining what the legal foundation for it would be. And we had options. We could have had a trilateral treaty between Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine, but that probably wasn't going to happen, mostly for political reasons. You know, the parties, two parties at war with each other are not likely to agree to anything. The other option was a UN General Assembly resolution, but legally that doesn't have any teeth. What does have teeth in the UN is a UN Security Council resolution. But the conclusion was ultimately made that that was probably not going to be available in time to meet the needs of getting the silos empty and getting the new crops into the silos for transfer. When you look at the political dynamics of a General Assembly or a Security Council resolution, first you have the permanent five with veto power, and the threat of a veto was going to be omnipresent. And then it takes time to develop a Security Council resolution. So we were looking around at alternatives, and I can tell you that I was actually lying in bed one morning and waking up, and I thought, you know, I think there might be something in the ISPS code about this. And I went back and I looked, and there is. And I also had forgotten that I had actually drafted it back in 2002, and I had completely forgotten about it. But it really seemed to fit, and here's the language. Contracting governments may conclude in writing bilateral or multilateral agreements with other contracting governments on alternative security arrangements covering short international voyages on fixed routes between port facilities located within their territories. It was actually, the language is almost perfect for creating the Maritime Humanitarian Corridor with the ISPS as a foundation. The other reason why this worked, I think, was the best fit is the only other option that we had was to rely on the law of naval warfare. And I really wanted to avoid that because the law of naval warfare allows for unilateral action by the combatants. And that's something that we really wanted to avoid. We wanted the ships to be able to transit safely without interference. Because I felt that if the law of naval warfare was relied on, this operation would become uninsurable. And we would not, and if war risk cover could be had, it would be astronomically expensive. So the ISPS code, all the parties agreed that that was a good way to go forward. The Lloyd's War Risk Committee and IUMI were comfortable with it, so that's the way we proceeded. And so what this culminated in was on the 13th of July last year. This was the first meeting where Ukraine and Russia had actually sat down at the same table. There's one thing that a lot of people notice about this picture. Anybody want to tell me what it is? I just heard it. There's no women in this picture. And so the UN is on the left-hand side. You can see my bald head there in the far left corner. And the UN got roundly criticized for the fact that there were no women on our delegation, and we got a good lesson learned from that. We actually did have women on our team. We should have had them at the table. But at this meeting, the parties all agreed on 7 basic principles that would need to be included in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And we got that agreement pretty quickly and without a lot of discussion. There had been a lot of behind-the-scenes work going on with the shuttle diplomacy, but getting agreement on these 7 principles for the initiative was really a key step. And that, of course, the media didn't believe it. The day that we met, this was on the front page of the New York Times, Mission Impossible. Officials wrangled to free Ukraine's grain. I was very happy to be able to show the New York Times that they were wrong. So almost immediately after we got agreement on the 7 principles, we started the drafting of the initiative. Interesting, you know, during the pandemic, we all learned how to deal with remote meetings and hybrid meetings. The negotiation of the initiative was actually all done remotely. We very rarely had the people in the room. We were under tremendous time pressure because President Erdogan, President Putin, and UN Secretary General Guterres and President Zelensky, they had agreed that the signing would occur on July 22nd. So we had about 4 to 4.5 days to actually negotiate the details of the initiative. And this is where we fleshed out the Joint Coordination Center process. Now, I can tell you that the initial drafts of the initiative, every party submitted a draft, and they were all about 5 pages long. What was actually signed was 1.5 pages. So a lot of the detail got cut out, and it was left to the Joint Coordination Center to work out those details. And as I said, we were consulting with Lloyd's War Risk Committee and IUMI almost every day on this, because as the negotiations developed, we said, is this going to work? Is this going to work? Because, as I said, we knew that we had to make this insurable. And of course, on July 22nd, there was the signing ceremony where UN Secretary Guterres called this a beacon of hope. And there was a lot of enthusiasm, and everyone was actually quite astonished that the initiative had actually been signed. It's called an initiative because, again, Ukraine and Russia did not want to be seen as agreeing with each other. So if you actually look at the initiative itself, it has 2 separate signature pages. One is the UN, Turkey, and Ukraine, and the other is the UN, Turkey, and the Russian Federation. And that went all the way through the JCC now. Every decision that's taken is in writing, and there's different signature pages. Of course, now I found out on the 22nd, I was asked to lead the UN efforts at the JCC. And I actually had to go back to London because I wasn't expecting this, and I had to go home and get more clothes because I had run out. And we were flying back to London that evening, and of course, on the morning of July 23rd, Odessa was attacked, and the port was attacked. And we thought this was going to fail before the ink was even dry on the initiative. So we called an emergency meeting of the parties at about lunchtime on the 23rd. And I think fortunately there were very cool heads in the room who said, yes, this happened. This is not our concern and our instructions are to get this initiative to work. And And that was very encouraging to hear that. And by the 26th, all senior JCC officials were in place, so each side had an equal vote in the JCC. And very soon thereon, the UN was named as both the secretariat and the moderator for the negotiations. So I took that role. And what we had to do was work out the details. And we were under incredible pressure because the world wanted to see a ship getting out of Ukraine. And we had a lot of details to work out. So we were pretty much working around the clock. There was a formal opening with the press in attendance on the 27th, and we were able to get the first ship out on the 1st of August. That's it on the right. It was the motor vessel Rizzoni, which was actually flagged in Sierra Leone and was headed to Syria. We had a lot of discussions on what the first ship would be. The purpose of the initiative was a humanitarian effort to get food to developing countries or grain to developing countries. As a result, there was one ship where the ship owner was putting tremendous pressure to be the first ship out, but that ship was loaded with feed corn that was going to go to the UK. So I was very much against that proposal because I thought providing feed corn to the UK so that people can enjoy nice steak dinners in London restaurants is not what this is about. We had to stay true to the purpose of it. So the Rizzoni was picked. It had a largely Syrian crew. The Rizzoni had been on their way out of the harbor. They were loaded and leaving. The pilot was on board, and they had one line left on the pier, and they got told to stop, don't go. So they were very happy to be the first ship out. I was actually on the inspection team for this first ship, and I went down to the engine room, and the engine room was absolutely spotless. It's an old ship, but it was absolutely spotless. And I said to the chief engineer, this is one of the cleanest engine rooms I've ever been in. And he said, well, what else did we have to do? So, as I said, negotiation of the details was what was really difficult. The Rizzoni and the first ones were all test transits while we refined the procedures. Now, the initiative says that ships can't be attacked if they are in the maritime humanitarian corridor. So it was really critical that we design a corridor that would protect against attack from the greatest extent possible, that there would be no provocations against merchant vessels transiting in the corridor. And what ultimately occurred was we developed a buffer zone that is 10 nautical miles in radius that is like a bubble that goes with the ship, and no military units can approach into the buffer zone. And the third thing was all military units are made aware every day of where ships are going to be in the maritime humanitarian corridor to prevent against accidents and accidental attacks or anything like that. So all the militaries know where the ships will be. Now, establishment of the route, it's very hard to see on the slide, but originally we had the route running all the way from Odessa to Istanbul. We ultimately concluded that that was not necessary, so we initially only had it run to the end, or the second iteration, we had it run to the end of the Russian declared war zone. Interestingly, the Russian declared war zone was bigger than the Lloyd's declared war risk zone. And that actually caused issues with the development of the route, because in between those two places was a significant navigational hazard that had to be navigated around. And so we were having a lot of difficulty designing a route that would avoid that hazard. It was a disused minefield, so we really didn't want ships going over it. and it was big. So the Russians eventually moved their declared war zone back so it aligned almost exactly with the Lloyd's war risk area. And that allowed us to create a route that's actually very simple. We had 3 criteria for the route. Number 1 was navigation safety. Number 2 was efficiency. We wanted to make it as straight a shot as possible. And number 3, we wanted something that was also provide the protections as best as possible. And through the negotiation in August, we were able to settle on a final set of procedures that is in IMO Circular Letter 4611 Add 1, and those procedures have remained in place ever since, really without much change. So as I said, the negotiations, these were really difficult negotiations, but what I found from a negotiating standpoint was if we kept them technical, there was a lot of respect on all sides for everybody's technical expertise. That was never really questioned, so that we were able to work, all 4 parties were able to work very closely together if we kept it technical. If it got political, it became more difficult, and that was a good lesson that I learned. So the procedures, ships have to apply to participate in the initiative, and the initial application goes to the Ukrainian Port Authority. After the Ukrainian Port Authority agrees that the ship can enter or leave their port, it is then sent to the JCC where the ship gets registered. And that has been causing a lot of discussion lately regarding the registration of ships. I'll get into that in a minute. And they're screened to make sure they're eligible to participate in the initiative. And that means they can only be carrying grain and only grain or fertilizer and ammonia. However, no fertilizer or ammonia has left any Ukrainian ports yet. And that is also an issue. When they're in the corridor, they're monitored continuously by the Joint Coordination Center. If they drift out of the corridor, they're subject to attack. So if a ship starts to drift out of the corridor, the JCC will contact them and tell them to get back on course. That has occurred. And then when they either arrive in Istanbul from Odessa or from wherever they're coming from, they're inspected by a joint inspection team. And so you have all 4 parties, the Russian Federation, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN, all provide inspectors. And for an inbound ship, the inspectors verify that the ship is truly in ballast. It's empty, has no cargo on board. And for outbound ships, they verify that they only have the cargo that's on the manifest, which is grain. And once the inspectors are satisfied, the ship is cleared, and it can either go into Odessa or it can head to its final destination. So as you can see, the number on the transits is wrong. It's up near 3,000 now, but for the 18th of August, we had the first 500,000 tons. Took us about a week to get to 1 million tons. It took us even less time to get to 2, so we doubled early. And now it should go over 30 million tons shipped out by the end of this weekend. So it's really been a success story. The primary cargo that's come out so far is corn. The secondary is wheat. And then other food products, particularly rapeseed oil, other vegetables, sunflower oil. Those are all cargoes that have been shipped out under the initiative. And what the impact has been is about 40% of the cargo is going to developing countries. That's been an issue. The Russian Federation has complained that not enough is going to developing countries of the actual cargo, but the real effect has been the stabilization of global food prices, affected by inflation through other factors, to be sure, but the index is down near where it was at the beginning of the war. So the current issues, as I mentioned, the distribution of cargoes is something that the Russian Federation is very concerned about. Of course, we had the reinsurance issues where a number of major reinsurers pulled out of reinsuring any ships coming in and out of Ukraine in December. That caused a significant issue with P&I in terms of them not being able to provide cover for ships. I think there are still some clubs who are unable to do it. Others have found a way around it. One of the choke points in the initiative is the number of inspection teams that each party fields. The initiative itself says that every country has to provide a minimum of 2, but should provide more if the demand requires it. An inspector can only physically do 3 to 4 inspections a day, or an inspection team. They're very difficult boardings. I was doing them at the beginning because we didn't have anybody else to do them, and you'd be exhausted after the 3rd boarding because you're climbing up and down a ship all around, and when a ship is in ballast, you're climbing up a very high pilot ladder. And so the lack of inspection teams led to a backlog. Right now, they're only inspecting 3 to 4 ships a day total, and those are only outbound ships. They're not inspecting any inbound ships right now because of the looming deadline. And so, especially in the fall of last year, there was a huge backlog of ships, and there is still a significant backlog of ships waiting to be inspected because of the lack of inspection teams. And we have some ships waiting for up to a month to get inspected now, which is a problem. As I mentioned, the registration of inbound vessels has ceased. The Russian Federation has said that they will not agree to register any vessel that can't be out of the Odessa ports by the 18th of May, which is the next termination point for the initiative. So, the initiative was initially drafted for 120 days, but it said that it could be extended for an additional 120 days. That was largely an automatic extension. One of the parties would have had to have affirmatively pulled out in order for the initiative to end on the 18th of October. So as I said, the 18th of October, there were issues. The Russians actually did stop participating in the JCC for 72 hours. But eventually the automatic renewal went into place. That went until the 18th of March this year. Martin Griffiths, the head of the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, negotiated an additional extension. However, there was not agreement on the date. The Russians agreed for another 60 days. The Ukrainians wanted another 120 days. So the default is that on the 18th of May, the Russians have said, unless there's an extension, they will not continue to participate. And this is not an automatic renewal. It's going to have to be negotiated. Now, there is going to be a high-level meeting in Istanbul tomorrow to discuss whether it will be extended. My personal view is I think it will be extended because each party is coming at this with different objectives in mind. And the Russians have varied objectives. And one of them is to be seen as a humanitarian partner on the global stage, particularly with African countries. If you look at what happens in the UN General Assembly when there are resolutions condemning the Russian Federation for the invasion, and you look at the voting patterns, you'll get about of the 192 countries in the UN, usually 142, 143 will vote yes, 5 or 6 will vote no, and then there's 40-something abstentions. And those abstentions tend to be developing countries. And I think that relationship is important, so hopefully it will be renewed. Now, there is an additional agreement that was signed on the 22nd of July last year, where the UN committed to assist the Russian Federation in getting sanctions relief to get Russian grain and fertilizer out. That has not been fully realized yet, a long way from it. There is some grain and fertilizer going out, but given that Russia and Belarus are the 2 largest producers of the chemicals required for fertilizer, they place a lot of importance on this second initiative that, as I said, has not been fully implemented yet. So that's part of the equation in terms of a renewal of the Black Sea Grant Initiative. And you have to look at that in the lens of getting stranded ships out as well, non-grain ships. You know, what is going to be the benefit to the parties if they are released? So I think the negotiators that are meeting in Istanbul this week are going to have a lot of work to do, but hopefully they will have success, and this will continue because it really is important for the human race. So thank you.